Tonight, we'll be looking at how we can save and protect our reefs and coral and fish that inhabit the waters around us. I know for many of the senior people who've been here for many, many years remember it 30 or 40 years ago. The waters around here were a very different state than they are today. And there's been one person over these years among our membership who has led the way in preserving our reefs and in bringing attention to the importance of our, of our waters around here. And she's with us tonight, and that's Martha Jokes. So she has taught many of us how to scuba dive. She's taught us about the waters. She's led efforts locally in the Antiguan community about preserving the mangroves and marine life in general. She is a force of nature. Martha, this evening we wouldn't having this without you, so thank you very much. She also introduced us to the two speakers tonight, Molly and Genevieve, and we met them. Arthur and I met them several months ago, and both of us were immediately impressed. And again, Martha has been a little bit like a den mother to these two young women who were very impressive. So thank you very much again, Martha. The Board of Governors recently approved setting up an independent 501c3 organization, which would be totally independent, to help preserve our reefs. And luckily enough, Arthur Gosnell has agreed to take on the leadership of this entity. Arthur has a passion for the water, for the reefs, and for the coastal lands. He's ideally suited to this mission, and he's begun to form a board to tackle these issues. And Molly and Genevieve have agreed to lead the effort on a day-to-day basis, on the ground or in the water. So we're very fortunate to have them. We're very fortunate to have Arthur leading the effort. And he's also one of the only Mill Reef members, I think the only Mill Reef member, who has an amphibious boat, which makes him uniquely qualified. So let me introduce Arthur and thank him for taking on this project, and for the many members who've helped along the way, including Fred Stell and Fuller Coles and Stuart Dansby and Stephen Hoke and many others. So with that, let me introduce Arthur, who all of you know, and take it from there. Thank you again tonight.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you all for joining us this evening as we talk about the Elkhorn Marine Conservancy, Elkhorn for Elkhorn Coral. The main emphasis this evening is to hear from our science team, Molly and Genevieve, and so I'll try to be brief so that we can get to the good part and hear from them. But I do have to quickly just make some thank yous and so forth. First to Andrew Headley, who kept the trains running on time as we work through this process with, one task after another. Next to Stephen Hoke, who has been spectacular in his consistent leadership with respect to conservation activities here at the club for quite some time. Then to Ralph, who as always provides the leadership and the vision, and here we are, thanks again to that vision and that leadership. And then finally to Martha, who again is a force of nature, and I occasionally needed oxygen tanks just to keep up with her and so forth. So thank you to all of you, and if we could just recognize those folks, that'd be terrific. So as Ralph said, we've been forming a 501c3. There's a fair amount of paperwork on that. The first paperwork went in on December 27th for registering in Delaware. And I am pleased to say that we now have a logo and a website, a mailing address, a checking account, and all kinds of good stuff like that. I'm also pleased to report that we have had folks send in contributions already, some by credit card through the website, some have directly sent us checks, some have sent us wire transfers. So the one things that our friends at JP Morgan Chase would love to see some of you consider would be to send in some appreciated security so they can show off a little bit as to how they process that. And remember, when you do that, you avoid a capital gains tax. So there are a lot of good reasons to do this. So in any event, we're really here this evening to hear from Molly and Genevieve and their plans and strategies to restore the reefs immediately to the east of us between Green Island and Exchange Bay. And with that, I am going to turn to Molly and Genevieve.
Thank you so much. Just wanted to do a quick mic check. Is yours going well?
How about, yeah, sound okay?
All right.
All right.
Well, I was gonna do a bunch of acknowledgements, but it seems that that's already been done. So thank you so much. But thank you so much, Arthur, for your incredible leadership in this and for your sense of urgency. And Martha as well. Thank you so much for connecting us with this wonderful club. We're super grateful to be here tonight. And before we get into the presentation, I'm just going to start with a very quick exercise. And so if it's comfortable for you and accessible for you, please raise your hand. Great. And now lower your hand if your employment or your livelihood is directly linked to the ocean around Antigua. And lower your hand if you've been for a swim today or you've gone snorkeling recently. Lower your hand if you've eaten locally caught seafood in the last few days. Seems like everyone's lowered their hand at this point. So I think everyone here has benefited, at least in the last few days, from our coral reef system, specifically the one that's just right behind us in our own backyard, so to speak. And that's exactly what we're here to talk about today. We're going to be talking about coral reefs in general, but we're going to be zooming in into the coral reefs that span the Mill Reef Club coastline. And so I'll start just quickly by presenting us. My name is Genevieve Byrne. Everyone calls me Jen, so feel free to do so. This is Dr. Molly Wilson, and we both have a background in biological sciences, particularly in relation to coral reef ecology and environmental management. Molly has had extensive experience conducting research in the Caribbean region, in Antigua specifically, and she recently completed her PhD in marine ecology from UC Santa Barbara Byrne School of Environmental Management, of Science and Environmental Management. So congratulations, Molly, on getting your PhD. I myself took a different route. I did a master's of marine management at Dalhousie University up in Canada. And I've been working with different agencies in the Caribbean to implement projects related to environmental management as well as climate change adaptation.
So Jen and I have both lived in Antigua and been working here for a number of years, and we're really committed to staying here because of the tremendous opportunity to do meaningful environmental work. Our vision is to help marine ecosystems thrive again by replenishing severely depleted populations of keystone species. And we have strong ties on the island to both governments and community members as well as businesses. And we've also built partnerships with some really important players in the region already doing restoration work, including Reef Renewal, the Plant a Million Corals Foundation, and Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute. And also through some really incredible Mill Reef members that we've met so far. We've also been exchanging ideas with Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and the Nature Conservancy. And so the Mill Reef Club, where we have the privilege of being tonight, was named in part for the incredible extent of coral reefs that once spanned this coastline. It's a little bit tricky to see with the projection, but this is a map from the 1980s. And this whole green area, which is quite extensive, from below Half Moon Bay all the way continuing north of Green Island, this at the time of the map in the 80s was all live coral reef. And this was made up primarily of these two acropora species, the Acropora palmata, which is the elkhorn coral, and cervicornis, which is the staghorn coral. Both of these species are particularly well suited to this part of the island because they love surge and strong wave activity. They form these incredible branching structures that are very strong and provide a number of really amazing ecosystem services.
Right. So corals are very much like the buildings in cities or the trees in a forest. And specifically these stony branching corals, they grow in such shapes that they provide little small holes and nooks and crannies that fish and invertebrates like to live in. And fish are very much like humans in the way that they want a specific location for their home. They want it to be a specific size, and they're picky about who their neighbors are. And so this incredible system of branching corals and stony corals provides the complex habitat that is needed to support marine biodiversity within our coral reef ecosystems. And I'm just going to bring your attention here to the left. This is an aerial imagery of the Mill Reef Club coastline, which I'm sure you can recognize. And I've put some arrows here to point towards the coral reef, which you can see are the darker areas. And you can notice here that coral reefs make these extensive walls and columns within the ocean. And what they're doing is they're dissipating the wave activity that is coming in from the Atlantic. And so it really calms down the water around the beaches where we like to swim, and it allows that peaceful environment for seagrass meadows and mangroves to grow in. And it's very likely that if these corals were not present, then the Mill Reef Club coastline would look very different nowadays. So we really need these coral reefs to protect and feed our beaches and protect those coastlines from constantly eroding. Coral reefs provide a number of different ecosystem services, just like food to feed ourselves, right? A lot of people here rely on fish from coral reefs to feed themselves. It also provides a space for leisure and discovery, as Martha knows really well, for snorkelers and divers. And in the Caribbean, and specifically in Antigua, most of our economy is based on marine and coastal tourism. So we need these reefs to survive. From a global perspective, 25% or a quarter of all marine life that we know about relies on this ecosystem and adjoining systems around it. And so its importance really cannot be overstated.
But what we're seeing now is that a lot of these corals have died, and with that, their structure begins to erode. So corals without their living tissue on the surface pretty much expose their calcium carbonate skeletons to essentially just dissolving with wave activity. And this is a video from Green Island. You can see on the left a picture of what this reef or this area looked like in the 70s. So these corals have already lost a lot of their structure, and they'll continue to degrade into rubble and eventually sand as time goes on. And as we lose these corals, we lose their structure, we also lose all of those essential services that Jen just outlined. And so before we go into sort of the why have we lost so much coral, this is just a quick introduction of what goes on in a healthy coral reef ecosystem. So corals, which are colonies of very small animals, essentially photosynthetic anemones, secrete this calcium carbonate structure, and this provides those incredible habitat spaces that Jen outlined for thousands of species of fish and invertebrates. And these corals are constantly competing on the seafloor with other organisms such as algae or seaweed for space and also for light to grow. And algae in particular are really strong competitors with coral. They can overgrow them, they can actually poison them, they can also secrete cues into the water that prevent coral larvae from settling onto the seafloor. So essentially the only way that corals can grow alongside algae is with these herbivore populations. And these herbivores on reefs can be either fish, including parrotfish, and also the tangs and doctorfish that you maybe see here. But they can also be invertebrates, such as certain species of crabs and sea urchins. And these herbivores are constantly grazing down algae and enabling corals to persist in these environments. But in recent decades, human impacts have altered how these ecosystems are functioning in many different ways. So first, overfishing has severely depleted a lot of these herbivore populations, namely the parrotfish populations. And this allows the algae to grow pretty much unchecked and outcompete corals. We also have invasive species such as the lionfish, we can talk about more later, that can alter the population dynamics of fish on coral reefs. Nutrient inputs from agricultural practices, lawn and garden fertilization, and also improperly used or managed sewage systems on boats and coastal homes. Also can flush directly into the environment, the marine environment, and have essentially the same effect on plants, algae in the sea as they would on plants and land, which is that they facilitate their growth and make it really hard for corals to keep up with that fight for space. Pollution can also trigger disease outbreaks that sometimes target coral species, such as a really bad one here in the Caribbean in the 1980s that targeted those 2 acropora species that we mentioned earlier. We're also experiencing changes in sea surface temperature, ocean acidity, and the frequency and intensity of storm events, all of which also have important consequences for coral survival. And lastly, physical damage, which can be from something as simple as putting your anchor in the wrong place or dragging a fishing net over live coral, or it can also come from more chronic initiatives like dredging for harbors or navigational channels, or coastal development. These can all directly damage corals and sometimes even destroy decades of growth in a matter of seconds. This is very hard to see, but essentially it's a map of the cumulative human impacts on the oceans from 2003 to 2013. And basically just to show that these red areas are areas where these cumulative human impacts have intensified the fastest over that period. So you can see that Antigua, which is over here in the Eastern Caribbean, falls in one of these intensification hotspots.
So a couple months ago in late 2020, some very generous Mill Reef Club members commissioned a coral reef baseline assessment. And so Molly and I jumped in the water at 20 different sites, as you can see here on the left. And we just recorded information. We collected data about the seascape, benthic composition, what the fish populations look like, the physical aspects of the area. We also looked at the socioeconomic context. And what we were really looking to do is assess the health of the coral reef, but also think of methods that could help revive the system.
So for anyone who's interested in our more detailed results, we'd be more than happy to provide a copy of our complete report, but we'll just highlight some of the findings here for you tonight. So first, in terms of live coral coverage, our assessment really documents how low live coral coverage is here in the region. So just to give a reference point, in healthy, more pristine reefs, corals usually cover about 40%, sometimes more of the seafloor. But at the sites we looked at here, this ranged from less than 1% in some sites to up to 22% at the highest coral cover sites. And these large expanses of coral skeletons really highlight what used to be here and how much has been lost. But there are some very important exceptions to this trend. We saw some notable coral colonies, some of which were really impressively large, that have survived the diversity of human impacts that they've been exposed to in recent decades. And of all the live coral that we did see, we didn't see any incidences of active disease, which is great. We also saw a really high abundance of algae and other coral competitors, with algae covering over 75% of the seafloor in some sites, which is very high. And a lot of this algae is palatable or edible to herbivores, which brings us to our next finding, which is that herbivore populations across the area are quite low. And you can see in this video, which is from Friars Head Bay, this reef is essentially devoid of all fish, including those really important herbivorous fish that we mentioned earlier. And these low herbivore biomasses, as well as some really interesting skewed size and sex distributions that we saw in the parrotfish populations here, all indicate overfishing. We also saw really low abundances of these diadema or long-spined sea urchins. And these are really incredible herbivores that used to be really abundant in the region. And they also experienced a disease outbreak in the 80s, also thought to be linked to pollution. And they've started to recover very patchily in some parts of Antigua, but we didn't see any signs of recovery along the Mill Reef coastline.
So aside from Exchange Bay, which is right behind us, the rest of the Mill Reef Club coastline is part of the Northeast Managed Marine Area, which we call the NEMA. And this was a designation that was given to this particular ecological zone, which I've outlined here in red, because there's a lot going on in terms of ecosystem services. It's a It has a lot of mangroves, seagrass beds, and coral. And that designation was provided so that the fisheries division could manage what type of activities were to happen within this zone. And so in 2007, they came up with a management plan. However, due to a lack of financing and human capacity, that plan was never implemented or enforced. So when we were doing our assessment, we saw a number of different uses. And before I go into that, I just want to say that due to the fact that there's no real management plan that's being implemented, I think it really highlights why it's so important to work from the ground up here in Antigua and work with those local ocean users to do any sort of restoration or conservation work. One of the uses that we did see while we were there was fishing. And there are some nearshore fishing grounds that still remain around the Mill Reef Club coastline. And I'm sure you guys know that there is a fishing dock here within the club. However, most of the fishermen are actually forced to go in deeper waters, more offshore, to find good, healthy fish stocks. And fishing in Antigua is incredibly important. Our country really relies upon it for our economy. Half of the agricultural GDP actually is derived from fisheries. And we have one of the highest per capita consumption of fish in the world. And so it's really important for food, as a food staple. It's important for employment, but it's also a source of cultural identity for these fishermen. And so we really look forward to working with these fishermen, along with consumers, to kind of talk about what species we should be eating. Molly did mention a lot of the algae overgrowth in the coral reef. And so we want to start talking with all the users around this area about the importance of preserving important herbivores such as parrotfish. Another use, which I'm sure you guys are all aware of, is yachting and sailboats. A lot of sailboats like to anchor around Green Island. And although we are a big fan of boating ourselves and we think it brings people closer to nature, there can be some impacts related to this activity. And Molly mentioned, anchoring, careless anchoring over seagrass meadows or coral reefs. And there's some boats, unfortunately, that disperse effluents into the water. So gray water, even black water in these nearshore environments, which can have really bad impacts and create disease, which could potentially kill off a lot of animals. Another activity we noticed was swimming, snorkeling, diving. Again, love this activity. Do it every day if I could. And again, this does come with perhaps some behaviors that could potentially have negative impacts on the reef, such as standing or kicking the reef if you're a new snorkeler, for example, and even just touching the coral. I mean, if you touch a coral and you don't know it has a disease and then you go and touch another coral, you can actually help propagate a disease underwater. And then finally, the Mill Reef Club coastline, just like every other coastline around Antigua, is just dotted with properties and gorgeous gardens and golf courses. And these are all really important activities. However, there are some inputs that we put into those spaces to keep them green that may affect the health of the marine ecosystem. So those are considerations that we looked at in our assessment as well. And so with all this information about the ecology, biology, socioeconomic context, Molly and I sat down and we decided upon a strategy to revive these reefs. And although we realized that top-down management and conservation is really a big part of the equation, our focus, I think, is really going to be on creating an active restoration program, which we can use as a platform to get ocean users involved, as well as educate people who are interested. And so what I mean by active coral restoration is I mean that we're going to actively help the system revive on its own. And we're going to be using a method called coral gardening. And coral gardening can directly help us increase coral population abundance and genetic diversity on the reef by planting corals back onto degraded reefs. And as I said before multiple times, our engagement with our primary stakeholders is extremely important to us. We really want the membership, but as well as the local community, to be in support of our program. And so we've already started engaging with the fisheries division in terms of permitting. We're going to be reaching out to all the relevant ministries. And in terms of working with local ocean users, we want to provide them employment opportunities as well as engage them in this informal marine spatial planning process. And what we hope to do is, with those two things, build the support that we need to protect a small area of restoration. And with time and with relationships growing, we hope to expand the geographical scope of that restoration site over time. In terms of creating an educational platform, Molly and I are still working with the Elkhorn Marine Conservancy Board as to what that strategy is going to look like. But ultimately, we want to get people in the water. We want to get the local community involved. We just want to get people aware of coral reefs and their amazing ecology. So coral gardening or coral restoration in this project will be a three-step process. The first is us going out in the wild and finding healthy coral populations and taking small fragments from them. And then we're going to bring them to a nursery, which will look like maybe a mixture of these things. There's tabletops and trees. And you just place these small coral fragments within that controlled nursery environment and you watch them grow. And when they're big enough to fend for themselves, then we'll be taking those corals and planting them back onto degraded reefs, and we'll be monitoring them annually for reproduction and growth. And consensus among experts is that when the restoration sites are chosen properly, that outplant coral survivorship is about 80%. So this really represents an incredible opportunity for us to create a reef that is successful in reproducing and expanding, and that can be resilient against climate change and other impacts in the future.
So just to give you an idea of what this can look like, this is a picture from Bonaire, where Reef Renewal Bonaire has 6 different permanent nursery sites in which they raise 5 different coral species. And combined, those nurseries have over 100 coral trees, which hold over 13,000 corals at a time. These photos are from Carysfort Reef in the Florida Keys, where the Coral Restoration Foundation has outplanted more than 130,000 critically endangered corals since 2007. And this is an amazing example from southern Belize, where the Fragments of Hope Community Coral Gardening Program has increased coral coverage at Laughing Bird Key National Park from less than 6% in 2001 to over 50% in 2017. And this long-term monitoring result really shows the potential of these corals to persist and start reproducing to repopulate the area.
Great. So in the first 2 years, we have a plan. It's a 3-step plan again. And thanks to Arthur and a number of other donors, we've actually started this phase as of Monday this week, which is super exciting. And so, as I've said, we've applied for the permits. We're engaging with those primary stakeholders. And this is really a phase where we're going to be designing and planning the restoration program. So what is the nursery going to look like? What methods are we going to be using? What research topics do we want to look at? And where are we going to find those coral fragments to populate the nursery? And then after those 3 months of planning, we're going to do our second step, which is project implementation. So this is where we build the coral nursery, we sink it, we start implementing these research projects, we continue to engage with our primary stakeholders, and this is where we're going to try to broaden our following by having a social media page and getting engaged in traditional media streams. And then after that, we'll populate our nursery and we'll watch the baby corals grow for about 12 months to 14 months, depending on the species. And we're just gonna make sure that local impacts and disease are managed. And once those corals are ready to go, then we will put them into our restoration site and start monitoring annually. So that's our first 2 years. And what we want to achieve in those first 2 years, in terms of restoration, we want to have at least 2,500 to 5,000 corals in our nursery, which is equivalent to about 2 acres, 1 to 2 acres of restored reefs after 2 years. And we also want to continue to work with those local ocean users, like I said, tour operators, fishermen, and tourists alike, to minimize local threats. And again, from an engagement perspective, we want to have a strong education platform, want to work with the membership here as well as the local community. And we want to create opportunities to get people involved within the area through employment. And then from a science perspective, we really want to collaborate with this incredible network of scientists and practitioners with the region to implement the leading restoration approaches. And we want to conduct research to improve outcomes, not only here, but in the region at large. And we want to implement long-term monitoring techniques such as 3D visualization and modeling, which will help us see year to year what the progress is in our project.
So as Jen alluded to, restoration is a long-term process, and continued monitoring of both our nursery and outplanting sites beyond those initial 2 years that we've just outlined is really essential in measuring the impacts of our restoration program. And these monitoring data are important not just to demonstrate our results to local stakeholders and funders, but also to build our global understanding of the impacts of these restoration projects and what the influential factors are in their success. And alongside that continued monitoring, we would also hope to continue stocking and maintaining the nursery into the future and continually expanding the coverage of those restored reef areas. And there are also numerous really exciting opportunities for expanding on this restoration work, including using and experimenting with different techniques to raise corals themselves. So this picture in the middle here is from Moat Marine Lab in Florida, where they've done a lot of work with microfragmenting, which is essentially where you break corals into very small pieces to stimulate faster growth rates. We can also raise corals under slightly elevated water conditions to select for genotypes that are more resilient against changing climates. And we can also experiment with raising and incorporating complementary herbivores like this Mithrax crab species here on the left, and raise them alongside our nursery corals and our outplanting sites to ensure that there's sufficient herbivory and these corals are remaining free of algae. A restoration program here at the Mill Reef Club would be an incredible example and really set a standard for subsequent restoration programs around the island and also in the region. And we would ultimately also hope to integrate the restoration and conservation of mangrove and seagrass bed ecosystems as well, because they're intrinsically very linked to the health of coral reefs and also provide numerous incredible ecosystem services on their own. And so if you're excited about this work and you want to be part of the solution, there are numerous pretty simple but very effective ways that you can make sure your day-to-day behaviors are supporting our reefs. So earlier we ran through some of the main ways that humans are impacting these ecosystems. And to address overfishing and also invasive species, be really picky about what seafood you're eating. We recommend trying to choose pelagic species like mahi and wahoo, which are very sustainable, or even better, ask for lionfish and try and help suppress these populations on our reefs. You can also participate in the Lionfish Derby, which I believe is currently scheduled for October of this year, COVID pending. We're very excited. If you do choose to eat reef species, which would be like snapper, grouper, lobster, be mindful of the close seasons for them here, and try to avoid eating parrotfish, which is called chub locally. If you're ordering something like fish cakes or fish fritters or stewed fish, be sure to ask what species is used to make it, because often it can contain parrotfish. Also, order or request some amazing local delicacies, including fish water, which is basically a fish head soup if you hadn't had it before, or fried mahi roe. It's not only really delicious and very nutritious, but also utilizes a lot of really valuable parts of the fish that are often just discarded and go to waste. So in addition to species, just try and get as much information as you can from your server, your fishmonger, or your chef in terms of where a fish was caught. Ideally, it would be caught locally, and also how it was caught. So certain methods like hook and line fishing and spear fishing are quite selective. They have really low rates of bycatch, and they don't have much and cause much damage to the environment. As opposed to other fishing practices like net fishing, which can cause a lot of physical damage and also has a lot of bycatch. Also be mindful that the choices you make in your home and garden can end up directly in the sea. and choose natural alternatives like compost and natural pesticides instead of chemicals. Make sure your septic system is up to date. Again, when you're choosing what to eat, try and support environmentally friendly agricultural practices that are reducing chemical and nutrient inputs into their system and therefore minimizing their harmful runoff. Also be mindful if you're boating or swimming that you may have some physical impact on the corals. This can be done by just always choosing a sandy bottom to anchor on and being careful not to touch or stand on corals when you're swimming.
So in our fight against climate change, your power really lies in your buying power. Every product or every service that you get from inception or creation to completion or disposal has a carbon footprint. And so by making choices like buying things that are durable and ethically sourced over single-use goods that are probably not biodegradable, you are sustaining or you're encouraging a sustainable economy. And same goes with investment. If you have the opportunity to do so, we definitely recommend investing in companies and organizations that are working to shape the future that you want to see for future generations. And finally, this one's pretty easy. We recommend not disposing any chemicals or effluents right into nature, not in the soil, not in aquatic systems. Everything at one point in time will make its way back to the ocean. And so simply making a switch to a reef-safe sunscreen can make all the difference. So finally, I just want to end by saying that in Antigua, the value of coral reefs cannot be overstated. We need them to feed ourselves, to protect the island. We need it for our economy. And so if you're interested and you care about our future generations, then I ask you to invest in the restoration of these reefs, because we really want to see our future generations being able to witness, but also reap the benefits of these incredibly valuable and endangered ecosystems. Please visit our website, emcantigua.org, and contact us at science@emcantigua.org, as we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much.
So everybody, I think we'd love to have some questions. Daniel may have some questions from the Zoom as well, but if anybody in the audience has questions, Wick, please.
I'm not quite sure why what's killed the original reefs won't kill the restored reefs. I mean, I didn't hear from you anything that you've done to change the likelihood that might happen or might not.
That's a great question.
Jen, can you please
sorry.
repeat the question for our members and friends on Zoom? So
Go for it. Yeah.
can you please repeat the
sorry.
question for the members and friends on Zoom?
Sorry. Okay. The question was, what will prevent corals now from dying from the same thing that caused such a big die-off in the 80s? Which is a great question.
Yeah, okay, I can go for it. So multiple things happened in the 1980s. And pollution was a big driver in these times. Raw sewage was getting pumped out into the ocean. There was a lack of regulation, let's just say, especially in the Caribbean, as a lot of these coastal properties and resorts popped up. And what that did is it caused a lot of disease. And two of the most important diseases that killed off our coral reefs were the one that affected the acropore species. And those are the branching corals that we spoke about. And this disease wiped out almost all of these corals. And it was in a very short period of time. And at the same time, pollution also likely induced disease in urchins, diadema urchins, which are one of the most important herbivores on our reef. And so what happens when your keystone coral species dies and your keystone herbivore dies at the same time is you get this incredible loss over 1 decade. And it's true. I mean, there are still diseases that are pervasive even now in this day and age. However, there has been a lot of advances in regulation to stop a lot of pollution going right in the water. I think a lot of people are a lot more aware now as well. And so with changing regulations and changing behaviors, we can only hope that a disease this bad won't happen again, at least not in the near future. you want to add to
Yeah,
that?
just to add, there's also a really incredible network now of people doing research to both detect diseases a lot faster and develop solutions for them. So there is a disease going around the Caribbean, mostly in Florida right now, in the Stony corals. And they've developed a probiotic treatment that has proven really effective. So just as an example of how to combat those types of things. But in looking at which corals suffer the most from those diseases, they find obviously if the overall ecosystem is healthier, then a lot of those corals are more resilient to fighting off those types of disease, as opposed to if it's stressed by other factors, like it's competing with an algae at the same time, then it might not be able to fight off the disease simultaneously.
Yes.
I'm really curious about the success of the outreach of other communities that you talked about, like the Reefs, et cetera. Overfishing is a big issue here. We were down in Indonesia diving 3 or 4 years ago, and we went to a marine reserve. The reef destruction there was different. It was about shark finning, but the effect was similar. And the way that this marine reserve dealt with the issue is to engage the locals, but they had to pay them to not fish. So I'm kind of curious, absent of that option, which is really obvious, how does that play out in other areas?
I think a lot of success can be given by maybe not just paying people off, which I don't think would be very effective in the Antiguan context, but by offering alternative sources of income. And when you look at the people, the demographic of the fishers that are fishing close to shore here, it's mostly older fishermen. For the younger fishers to get involved, there's not much left on the inshore reefs. So I think that's a huge focus for us, is just engaging with people, even if it's going to take maybe a generation to see the number of fishers going down, trying to get them more aware of what's going on the reef and aware of the other opportunities that they have other than that specific type of fishing. Yeah.
I had a similar question at Barbara. The fisherman, there is a special fisherman who has access to the right fish.
Yeah.
I mean, just the other day, they literally had a plate. I passed there sometimes. Filled with definitely, small fish that were probably against the wall. And with that, how important would it be, or is there a possibility to actually involve that particular group? Because they could literally break the success of a comment like that.
Yeah.
They would, almost part of your team or
Definitely. Yeah. Sorry, I forgot to repeat the last question for Zoom, but this question is if we can engage this particular group of fishermen that have access right to the beach within the Mill Reef property. I don't know if you want to go, I can go, but that's, yeah, one of our main priorities is working with this particular group. I think one of the advantages of working with coral right off the bat and ultimately bringing in other initiatives such as trying to change fishing behaviors is that coral isn't edible and it benefits everybody. So it's a really great platform to get buy-in from people like those fishermen who, I mean, obviously we don't want them setting nets right over the coral, but from the get-go, we wouldn't really be asking much different of them in terms of their fishing behavior, but hopefully trying to get them involved with the nursery, both from sort of an educational standpoint, but also, I mean, these nurseries require people to clean the corals, people to take boats out. Ideally, people will want to come visit them. So there's tourism opportunities there. That kind of all depends on sort of what we're working on this planning phase is getting engaged on what the Mill Reef Club members want in terms of the scale of the nursery, how many people they want coming and all of that. But once we have that sort of dialed in, we can figure out exactly where the opportunities are to bring those other people in.
And if the question relates to herbivory and trying to maintain herbivory through fish populations, Molly and I definitely want to work with different species that are probably not as palatable or not, not purchased for food, like sea urchins, or there's a specific type of Mithrax crab that eats a lot of different algae, and we want to integrate them into our restoration plan. And so we're getting that benefit of herbivory, and we're simultaneously working with the fishermen, kind of just starting little step by step, and every approach that we can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the fishing is a critical issue, but not something that will happen overnight. So
Yeah.
we're trying to be creative about how to
A
work our
question
way
from
in.
our
Haley?
friends on Zoom. Question from our participants on Zoom.
Okay.
Are you able to do farming in shallow water so workers and volunteers could help while snorkeling as opposed to having to use scuba gear?
That's a great.
That's a great question. We've identified a series of different nursery sites. Some are deeper than others. Ultimately, for the survival of the coral, I think that there's a really healthy zone around the 10-meter range, about 30 feet. However, if we use methods such as coral trees, these are essentially suspended within the water column. So depending on the snorkeler's ability, they may be able to free dive down and see the coral trees. In terms of maintenance and getting people, cleaning and potentially collecting data, we would have to set up a nursery that is in a shallower area. And so we're currently working with Arthur and the rest of the Elkhorn Marine Conservancy board to identify where those nursery sites will be. So stay tuned.
Michaeli, do you have a question?
Oh, great question. Or COVID. Oh, I said it once about lionfish.
It was relevant in our baseline.
Can you repeat the question
assessment.
for me,
Oh,
please,
sorry.
Jen?
Yeah, sorry. So the question was, sargassum hasn't come up in the last hour. Is that going to affect your project? And it was a part of our assessment. We looked at where sargassum floats kind of naturally gather within the Mill Reef Club coastline. And we made sure that all the sites that we identified for nurseries wouldn't be affected by those sargassum floats. In terms of sargassum affecting coral reefs, if they're large enough and the floats stay atop a coral reef for a very long time, it can stop the sunlight from penetrating the water column and stop the animals from photosynthesizing. So it can definitely have an impact. However, here, I don't assume that the corals would be heavily impacted by sargassum floats. That's an assumption.
Daniel?
Do you think more global impacts, such as ocean warming, have contributed to decline around Antigua's coral reefs?
So I'll start and you can add if you want. Yeah, climate change has been having impacts on our reefs for several decades now. There's been some mass bleaching events in the Caribbean. And I think that it has contributed to their demise. I don't think it had the same kind of widespread and immediate impacts like disease did. I think that the remaining corals, the ones that we have, especially the large colonies, they've lived through the disease. They've lived through the climate change and those bleaching events. And so inherently, they have better genetics to be able to survive in the future. And when you're starting a coral restoration program, you're mixing in a lot of different fragments from a lot of different living reefs. And hopefully by planting them together, we'll be able to entice sexual reproduction and cause new genetics to be formed on the reef, some genetics that are stronger and more resilient to climate change.
I have one more question. In terms of the government, it's always really important that from above, you have to support how you guys work. Currently, is the government, the Antigua government, or what's the relationship?
Yeah, well, Jen actually used to work for the government.
Oh, wait,
here.
let's just repeat that.
Oh, sorry, the question is, do we have experience working with the government here, as that will obviously be very important in this type of project? Yes, we've been actively working with the fisheries division here. They're the division that's directly responsible for giving permits for these types of projects. And Jen also used to work for the Department of the Environment. So we're in close communication with them, and people have been very supportive so far in terms of being excited to see it go forward. I think in terms of, assuming someone's going to show up and patrol an area for us is a different story. But for right now, people seem supportive of us getting it started, as it would bring a lot of positives to Antigua in general.
Yes.
I know another issue, a marine issue that the club has faced over the last year is
the debris from the Sargasso Sea that has been, landing on our beaches. And it seems to be very cyclical, and there are a lot of research activities underway. Has that had an effect on our reefs, and are you working with some of the people that are also looking into the Sargasso Sea?
Yeah, another question about sargassum. Well, we, as Jen kind of mentioned, sargassum is not, we definitely would not place a nursery site in an area that is predisposed to collecting sargassum. When it's floating in just naturally in the water, it won't have an impact, but it's when it collects and starts to degrade that it could potentially harm the corals. So that's definitely a priority in choosing our nursery sites, is avoiding those areas.
Other questions? Daniel, do you have any more?
Has stony coral tissue loss disease shown up yet in Antigua? I think it's not an aquapora disease, but it could become a new threat.
That's a great question. So yeah, that's the major disease going on right now that we were referring to earlier, that started in Florida and has been spreading around the Caribbean. It has not been detected yet here in Antigua, but I assume it will be at some point. And there have been some treatments, some probiotic treatments that have been developed. A lot of other programs that have big restoration projects actually have specific sort of like an emergency plan and an emergency fund set up to treat corals if that becomes an issue in their nursery or their outplanting sites.
Right.
Paige.
You showed photographs of reefs that had really died and had been restored in Florida and Belize in various places. Did those locations face some of the same challenges that we faced here and some of the same reasons for die-off? And do they have best practices or lessons learned that are shared with the scientific community that could be applicable here?
Great question. So Paige just asked us if those examples that we showed earlier from Bonaire, Florida, and Belize, if those places are getting affected by the same impacts that we're seeing here, and if there are best practices and networks that we can reach out to implement similar solutions. And I think the answer here is yes. They're faced with very similar impacts. Obviously, from reef to reef, things vary a little bit. However, Molly and I are part of a really incredible growing network of scientists and practitioners within the region, and it's all open communication. Everyone wants to share their best practices, how to get over different impacts and what methods are working the best. And so absolutely, we look forward to working with these people.
And contributing as well.
And contributing to the science as well, yeah.
Daniel, do you have more questions?
Sure. What are the costs associated with this project?
What are the costs?
Yes.
So the costs, sorry? Oh, repeat the question?
Zoom.
Oh, it came from Zoom. So the question from Zoom was, what are the costs associated with this project? And so typically speaking, coral restoration projects are a little bit more expensive than, say, a mangrove restoration project, just because it takes so much longer for these corals to grow. And so you have to put in a little bit more time. However, Molly and I have been very cost efficient. We're thinking about the best methods that we can implement that'll be best in terms of investment. And we're looking at about $150,000 to $200,000 a year for the next 5 years.
And that also is slightly scalable depending on what we come up with during the planning phase in terms of what the members are looking for. And yeah, basically depending on the resources that can be made available, you can sort of scale your project accordingly.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that we have really ambitious goals here.
Yeah, we're ambitious.
So yeah, we don't.
Yeah. Arthur, there was a question in the front. Do you still?
Yes, with certain kind of plant diseases, you pretty much lost that field forever as far as going back to the same crop.
Okay, yeah.
Can you take these skeleton reefs and establish new colonies on them, or is that area lost?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so the question was if an analogy from plant systems where if there's a disease outbreak in a field, you can't go back and plant the same exact crop. And if that's similar in reefs where we can plant new corals back onto these areas of coral skeletons. And the answer is yes, you definitely can plant directly on the dead skeletons, and it's actually can be used to our advantage to plant live tissue on skeletons that still have some sort of structure. And we've been talking a bit with some of the people at Woods Hole about techniques that they have I think they call it reskinning, but essentially you're putting live tissue onto an old skeleton to try and give that coral a boost. Instead of having to grow the skeleton its own, it starts out with that structure, which is amazing.
Yeah.
And sort of speeds up the whole process.
Yeah, so essentially when a coral dies, what you're left with is just calcium carbonate. It's just a rock. So you can clean that rock, plant another one, or reskin it.
Any other questions? All set, Daniel? Martha?
Yeah, can I just make a comment that I heard very much what both Bettina and Barbara commented, and it's a big concern that, you know, you create a beautiful new thriving reef and suddenly local fishermen come in their little boats and they wipe them all out. So all these beautiful French angels and parrotfish or whatever, they're gone. And it's like, God. And we've all talked about that, and it's a big concern. But, you know, you have to try. And these girls have a great idea of trying to engage the local fishermen, to educate them, to get them involved. I mean, there's big ideas here of young Mill Reef teenagers getting involved in snorkeling on these sites and things. So maybe some of those same fishermen that used to take them might be boat operators and take snorkelers to see the fish and the fish life and things. We don't have all the answers here, but if you don't try, then, you know, we know what's going to happen. And as Dr. Sylvia Earle says, no green, no blue. So if we don't take care of what we got and try, then, you know, that's all we can do. And hopefully some of the answers we're going to have to figure out as we go along. And I'd just like to say thank you to Ralph and the whole team for even taking this step forward, because this is, in my mind, one of the biggest steps I've seen Mill Reef step into unknown territory of something that, you know, could make a huge difference. Maybe not for any of us in this room, but for your grandchildren and the future generations that come to Mill Reef. So thank you, girls, for trying.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much. And Ralph, do you have any more quick announcements or anything like that?
Thank you, brilliant. You guys were fantastic. Thank you, Arthur. That was really great. Well done. No, I think the only thing I'd like to sort of emphasize, you know, I re-emphasize what Martha said, is that it's really going to take a lot of engagement with the different stakeholders in Antigua. I mean, it was sort of after the first question that you asked, Wick, was how is this not going to just get degraded again? And you've got to work with the fishermen, you've got to work with the local stakeholders in order for this to last, because there's no sense in building all this unless if it just gets destroyed again. So we're going to have to work at it. I've already had a conversation with the Prime Minister about it. He wants to help. He said that deliberately. And so I think we're planning to go, you know, visit him in the next couple of weeks and put him to it. So, you know, it's important. So I think, you know, this is a beginning and we're going to make some mistakes, but thank you both of you, and thank you, Martha, for the first step forward, and thank all the club members for being so generous to date. It's really fantastic. So welcome. Thank you very much.